My son and his wife tried to take everything from me in a courtroom, and they were smiling when they did it, as if I were already gone, as if my life had already been packed into boxes and carried out without me even noticing. And the strange thing is I didn't say a word. Not then. Not when their lawyer stood up and listed every possession they believed belonged to them. Not when my son avoided my eyes like I was a stranger. And not even when my daughter-in-law let out a soft laugh that echoed just a little too loudly in that quiet room. Because by that point, I had already learned something about silence, something they hadn't, something they were about to understand the hard way. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because that moment in the courtroom didn't begin there. It started days earlier, long before the polished wood benches and the steady voice of the judge. It started in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that used to feel peaceful before everything changed. I remember standing by the sink, watching the sunlight fall across the countertop, thinking about nothing more than whether I should make eggs or oatmeal, when the knock came at the door, firm, official, not the kind of knock family uses. And when I opened it, there was a man in a gray suit holding an envelope with my name printed neatly across the front, Margaret Collins, like it belonged to someone else, like it didn't belong to the woman who had spent over 40 years building a home, raising a son, and believing that family meant something permanent. I took the envelope without asking questions, because at my age you learn that answers come whether you're ready for them or not. And when I opened it, standing right there in my doorway, I saw the words that didn't quite make sense at first, legal language, formal phrases, but one line stood out clear enough to cut through everything else. Petition for transfer of assets, filed by Daniel Collins and Ashley Collins, my son and his wife. And I remember thinking it had to be a mistake, the kind of clerical error you hear about, but never expect to touch your own life, because Daniel would never do that, not the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, not the man who called me every Sunday, even after he married Ashley, or at least he used to. But even as that thought crossed my mind, something colder followed right behind it, something quieter, the realization that things had been changing for a long time, just slowly enough that I had convinced myself it wasn't real, that the shorter phone calls, the canceled visits, the way Ashley had started speaking for him more and more, all of it had seemed small on its own, harmless even, until it wasn't, until it added up to a moment where I was standing alone in my doorway holding a document that said my own son was asking the court to give him everything I owned, my house, my savings, even the small things that carried more meaning than value, things his father and I had built together over a lifetime. And I didn't cry, not then, because the truth is, when something breaks that deeply, it doesn't shatter all at once, it just shifts quietly into place. Like a door closing somewhere far inside you, I stepped back into the house, closed the door, and read the document again, slower this time, noticing details I had missed, dates, signatures, the involvement of a law firm I didn't recognize. And that's when I realized this wasn't sudden, it wasn't impulsive, it was planned, carefully, deliberately, and the strangest part was how calm I felt, not because I wasn't hurt, but because somewhere in that calm, there was clarity, a kind I hadn't allowed myself before, because when you spend years trying to hold a family together, you learn to ignore the cracks, to smooth things over, to tell yourself stories that make everything feel normal. But standing there with that paper in my hands, I couldn't tell myself those stories anymore. And for the first time in a long while, I saw things exactly as they were, not as I hoped they would be. And that's when I made a decision, not a loud one, not something I announced or even fully explained to myself at the time, but a quiet decision to stop reacting the way they expected me to stop being the woman who tried to fix everything, because whatever was coming next, I had a feeling it wouldn't be fixed with words or patience. It would require something else entirely, something they clearly believed I didn't have. And as I folded the document and placed it carefully on the kitchen table, I remember thinking how strange it was that they thought this would end with me losing everything, because they had no idea that what they were about to take from me was the one thing I had already decided to let go of. And that was the moment, standing alone in my quiet house, that I realized the courtroom wasn't where this story would begin. It was where it would finally reveal itself. I did not call Daniel that day, and that was the first thing that felt different, because for years I had been the one who reached out first, the one who filled the silence before it could grow too loud. But this time I let it sit. I let the quiet stretch across the house the same way the morning light had, slow and steady, as if it were trying to show me something I had been too busy to notice before. And as the hours passed, I began to see the pattern more clearly, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small memories that came back to me one by one. The kind you dismiss when they happen but cannot ignore when they line up together, like the time Ashley suggested they handle my bills for me because it would be easier, her voice soft and polite, her smile perfectly practiced, and I had agreed because it seemed reasonable at the time. Because that is what families do, they help each other. But now I remembered how quickly that arrangement had changed, how the statements stopped arriving at my house and instead went to theirs. How Daniel had told me not to worry about the details because everything was taken care of, and I had believed him because he was my son, because I trusted him in a way that went beyond logic, the kind of trust you do not question until it is already broken. And then there were the visits that grew shorter, the holidays that became more about their schedule than ours. The way Ashley would gently correct me in conversations, speaking over me as if I were forgetting things, as if I needed guidance in my own home. And I remember telling myself it was nothing, that it was just a new generation doing things differently. But standing there in my kitchen that morning, with that document resting on the table, I could no longer pretend those moments were harmless. They were steps, each one leading to this. And the realization did not come with anger, not at first. It came with something quieter, something colder, a kind of understanding that settled into place like a final piece in a puzzle I had been assembling without realizing it. And I spent the rest of that day moving through my house in a way I never had before, not as someone who lived there, but as someone seeing it for the first time, noticing the details that carried meaning, the worn edge of the kitchen counter where Daniel used to sit as a boy doing his homework, the framed photograph in the hallway of my husband smiling in that way that always made everything feel steady. And I paused there longer than I expected, because if anyone would have understood what was happening, it would have been him. He always saw things more clearly than I did, especially when it came to people, and I wondered what he would have said if he were still here, whether he would have warned me sooner, or whether he had already tried in ways I had not fully listened to, because there had been conversations, subtle ones, about keeping certain things in order, about making sure everything was protected, and at the time I thought he was simply being careful, the way he always was. But now those words carried a different weight, and as I stood there, I realized something else, something that shifted everything just slightly, but enough to matter. I was not as unprepared as they believed, and that thought stayed with me as the afternoon turned into evening, and the house grew quiet again, not the same kind of quiet as before, but a more deliberate one, as if the silence itself were waiting, and I made myself a simple dinner, something I barely tasted, and sat at the same table where I had spent countless meals with my family. Except this time I did not set an extra place. I did not imagine conversations that would not happen. I simply sat there and let the truth settle in fully, without softening it, without trying to make it easier to accept, because sometimes clarity requires that kind of honesty. And by the time I cleared the dishes and turned off the lights, I knew that whatever came next would not be about convincing them of anything. It would not be about explaining or defending myself. It would be about something else entirely, something they had already underestimated. And later that night, as I sat in the living room, with only a small lamp casting light across the room, I reached for the drawer where I kept important papers, not out of panic, but out of curiosity, and I began to go through them slowly, carefully, noticing what was there and what was not, noticing what had changed over time, and with each page I turned, that calm feeling returned, stronger now, more certain, because the truth was beginning to take shape in a way that did not rely on assumptions or memories, but on something far more solid, something that could not be dismissed or explained away. And as I closed the drawer and sat back, I realized that the story they were preparing to tell in that courtroom was not the same story I was holding in my hands, and that difference, quiet as it was, would be everything. The next morning did not feel like a continuation of the life I had been living. It felt like stepping into something quieter and far more deliberate, and I woke earlier than usual without needing an alarm. The house still wrapped in that soft pre-dawn silence that used to comfort me, but now it simply gave me space to think without interruption, and I made my coffee the same way I always had, measured, steady, as if routine itself could anchor me. But my mind was not on the day ahead in the ordinary sense. It was already moving through possibilities, through questions I had never asked before, not because I was afraid of the answers, but because I had never believed I would need them. And as I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope still resting where I'd left it, I noticed something I had overlooked the day before, a small line near the bottom of the page referencing prior financial authorizations, documents. I did not remember signing, and I felt that same quiet shift again. Not panic, not even anger, but a sharpening of attention, the kind that comes when something no longer fits the story you have been telling yourself. And I stood up, walked back to the drawer in the living room, and began searching more carefully this time, not just looking at what was there, but looking for what should have been there and was not. And it did not take long to realize that several key documents were missing. Statements, agreements, things my husband had always insisted we keep in order. And that absence told me more than anything I could have read on those pages. Because absence, when it is intentional, carries its own kind of message. And I sat back slowly, letting that realization settle. Because it meant this had gone further than I had allowed myself to believe. It meant decisions had been made without me. Signatures placed where they should not have been, or perhaps where they should have been. But under circumstances I did not fully understand. And I thought about calling Daniel then, asking him directly, demanding an explanation. But the thought passed just as quickly as it came, because I already knew how that conversation would go. I could hear his voice in my mind, careful, distant, guided more by someone else than by his own instinct. And I knew I would not get the truth that way, not the full truth. And so I did something I had not done in a very long time. I chose not to react. I chose instead to gather, to observe, to understand. And that decision led me somewhere unexpected later that morning, because as I was sorting through old folders, I came across a business card tucked between two documents, one I had not looked at in years, the name printed clearly, Thomas Grayson, the attorney who had handled my husband's estate. And I remembered him immediately, not just because of his work, but because of the way he spoke, direct but patient, the kind of man who explained things fully even when you did not realize you needed the explanation. And I held the card for a moment longer than necessary, considering whether reaching out would make things more complicated or more clear. But in the end, clarity mattered more, and I dialed the number with a steadiness I did not question. And when his voice answered on the other end, older but still recognizable, I introduced myself, half expecting he might not remember me after all these years. But there was a pause, followed by something in his tone that shifted, recognition, and perhaps something else, something like concern. And when I told him why I was calling, there was another pause, longer this time, and he did not rush to fill it, which told me more than any immediate answer could have. And when he finally spoke, he did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply said that he thought it would be best if we spoke in person, that there were details better explained face to face. And that was when I knew, without him needing to say anything more, that this situation was not as straightforward as it appeared, that there were layers to it I had not yet uncovered. And we agreed to meet that afternoon. And as I ended the call, I noticed how different I felt compared to the day before. Not lighter, not relieved, but more certain, as if each piece of information was slowly forming a path I had not seen before. And as I prepared to leave the house, I took one last look around, not with nostalgia, but with awareness, because whatever came next would not just be about defending what was mine. It would be about understanding how it had ever come into question in the first place. And as I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I realized something else, something that settled quietly but firmly in my mind. They believed this process would be simple, that it would follow a predictable path where I would be overwhelmed, confused, and eventually compliant. But they had not accounted for one thing. Not really. They had not accounted for what happens when someone stops being afraid of losing what they have and starts paying attention instead. Thomas Grayson's office was exactly as I remembered it, quiet in a way that felt intentional, with shelves lined neatly with files and books that seemed untouched by time. And when I stepped inside that afternoon, I felt something settle in me, not comfort exactly, but a sense that I had come to the right place. And he greeted me with a firm handshake, his expression calm but observant, as if he had already begun piecing things together before I had even taken a seat. And once we were sitting across from each other, I placed the document on his desk without saying anything at first, letting him read it in full, watching his eyes move slowly across the page. And I noticed the moment his expression changed, just slightly, not dramatic, but enough to confirm what I had begun to suspect. And when he finally looked up, he did not ask me how I felt about it. He did not offer sympathy. Instead, he asked a simple question, whether I had signed any recent authorizations regarding my assets, and I answered honestly, telling him about the arrangements Ashley had suggested, about the convenience it seemed to offer at the time, and he listened without interrupting, his fingers lightly resting on the paper, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath, not of surprise, but of recognition, as if he had seen something like this before, and that was when he began to explain, carefully, clearly, the kind of explanation that does not overwhelm but instead reveals, layer by layer, what has been hidden beneath the surface, and he pointed to specific sections of the document, clauses that referenced authority transfers, conditional permissions that could be interpreted in ways I had not considered, and as he spoke, I realized that what had seemed like small decisions at the time had created a structure, one that allowed Daniel and Ashley to position themselves in a way that gave them leverage, not full control, but enough to make a claim, enough to stand in a courtroom and argue that they had a right to what they were asking for. And I listened without interrupting, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to understand every detail, every step that had led to this point. And when he finished, there was a brief silence, one that felt heavier than the ones before, because now the situation was no longer uncertain, it was defined, and I asked him directly what it meant for me, not in terms of emotion, but in terms of reality, and he did not hesitate. He told me that if the court accepted their argument without challenge, they could potentially gain significant control over my assets, not because they were entitled to them in the way a family should be, but because the paperwork could be interpreted in their favor. And that was when I felt something shift again, not fear, but clarity sharpening into something more focused, because if this was about interpretation, then it was not as final as they believed. And he must have seen that in my expression, because his tone changed slightly, becoming more deliberate, and he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder, one I did not recognize at first, but when he opened it and turned it toward me, I saw my husband's name, and something inside me went still, because whatever was in that folder had been prepared long before any of this had happened. And Thomas explained that my husband had made certain provisions, not out of distrust, but out of caution. He had believed in planning for possibilities, even uncomfortable ones, and as Thomas walked me through the contents, I began to understand that there were protections in place, conditions that had to be met for any transfer of assets to be valid, conditions that required transparency, consent, and most importantly, integrity in how those decisions were made. And if those conditions were violated, the consequences were clear, not dramatic, not punitive in the emotional sense, but precise. The kind of precision that leaves no room for argument once it is revealed, and I felt a quiet steadiness return, not because everything was solved, but because the situation was no longer one-sided. It never had been, and yet Daniel and Ashley had acted as if it were, as if I were simply a step in a process they had already completed. And I realized then that their confidence was built on assumption, on the belief that I would not question, would not look deeper, would not seek the kind of clarity I was sitting in now. And Thomas closed the folder gently, his gaze steady as he looked at me, and he said something that stayed with me long after I left his office. He said that situations like this are not won by emotion. They are resolved by truth, and truth, when documented properly, does not need to raise its voice. And as I stood to leave, I felt that same quiet certainty I had begun to recognize, not loud, not dramatic, but firm. And when I stepped back out into the afternoon light, I understood that the courtroom they were so confident about was not a place where I would be defending myself. It was a place where everything would finally be seen for what it truly was. And for the first time since this began, I did not wonder what would happen next. I simply knew that whatever it was, it would not unfold the way they expected. When I returned home that evening, the house felt different again, but not in the hollow way it had the day before. It felt quieter with purpose, as if every room had settled into a kind of stillness that was no longer empty, but waiting. And I placed my keys on the table with the same steady motion I had used for years, noticing how familiar everything still was, how unchanged the surface of my life appeared despite what was unfolding beneath it. And I walked slowly through each room, not searching for anything in particular, but allowing myself to see it all clearly, The furniture we had chosen together, the photographs that told a story no one else could fully understand, and I realized that none of these things had ever truly been about ownership. Not in the way Daniel and Ashley were trying to define it. They had been about memory, about time, about the quiet accumulation of a life lived with intention. And that was something no document could transfer, no argument could rewrite. And yet the documents still mattered, the structure still mattered, because that was where this would be decided, not in the emotions I carried, but in the facts they believed they had already secured. And I thought about everything Thomas had shown me, the conditions, the safeguards, the quiet foresight my husband had put in place. And I understood now that what I had once seen as simple caution had been something far more deliberate, something designed for a moment exactly like this, even if neither of us had wanted to imagine it. And I sat down at the dining table, the same one where I had opened the envelope the day before, and for a long moment I did nothing at all. I just allowed the silence to exist without filling it, because I was beginning to understand that silence was not absence. It was space, space to think, space to decide, space to act without being pushed. And when I finally reached for the documents Thomas had given me, I did so with a clarity I had not felt in a long time. Not rushed, not reactive, but deliberate. And I began to read them again, more slowly this time, noticing the language, the precision, the way each clause connected to the next, forming something that was not just protective but intentional. And I realized that the strength of it was not in complexity, but in its simplicity. It relied on truth, on whether actions aligned with what had been agreed upon, and if they did not, the outcome was not a matter of opinion, it was defined, and that thought stayed with me as the evening stretched on, and I found myself thinking not about what I might lose, but about what had already been revealed, because in the span of a single day, I had seen my situation more clearly than I had in years. I had seen the distance that had grown between myself and my son, not as something sudden, but as something gradual, shaped by choices I had not fully questioned at the time. And I thought about the conversations we had shared, the moments where something had felt slightly off, but not enough to confront. And I understood now that avoidance had its own cost, that by choosing not to see those small shifts, I had allowed them to grow into something larger, something that now stood in a courtroom waiting to be argued. And yet, even with that realization, I did not feel regret in the way I might have expected, because regret looks backward, and what I needed now was to move forward with clarity. And that meant accepting what was without trying to reshape it into something else. And as that understanding settled in, I also recognized something else, something quieter, but just as important. Daniel and Ashley believed they were in control of this situation, not just because of the documents they had filed, but because of the way they saw me. They saw someone who would hesitate, someone who would avoid conflict, someone who would choose peace even at her own expense. And for a long time, that had been true. But what they did not understand was that peace is not the same as silence, and silence is not the same as surrender. And as I sat there in that familiar room, I realized that the version of me they were expecting to face in that courtroom no longer existed in the way they believed, not because I had become someone else entirely, but because I had finally stopped trying to be what they needed me to be. And that shift, quiet as it was, changed everything. And later that night, as I turned off the lights and prepared to rest, I felt no urgency to reach out to them, no need to explain or to ask why, because whatever answers they might have given would not change what was already set in motion. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was reacting to their actions. I felt like I was preparing for something of my own, something they had not anticipated. And as I lay in bed, the house once again settling into its nighttime quiet, I understood that the next time I would see them would not be across a kitchen table or in a casual conversation. It would be in a place where every word carried weight, where every assumption would be tested, and where the truth, once spoken, would not need to be repeated. And with that thought, I closed my eyes, not with uncertainty, but with a calm that came from knowing that whatever they believed they had already secured, they had not yet seen the full picture, and soon enough, neither of us would be able to ignore it. The morning of the hearing arrived without urgency, and that in itself felt like a quiet kind of control, because for days I had imagined what it might feel like to wake up knowing everything would be decided within hours. But when the moment finally came, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation of something that had already been unfolding long before any court date had been set. And I moved through my routine the same way I always had, making coffee, straightening the kitchen, pausing briefly at the window as the light settled over the yard. And there was no rush in any of it, no sense of panic, only a steady awareness that each step mattered in its own quiet way. And when I dressed, I chose something simple, not because I wanted to appear unremarkable, but because I understood that nothing about this day would depend on appearances. It would depend on what had already been written, already been decided in ways they had not taken the time to understand. And as I gathered my things and prepared to leave, I took one last look at the house, not with attachment, but with clarity, because I knew now that whatever happened in that courtroom would not change what this place meant to me. And that distinction gave me a kind of calm I had not expected, and the drive to the courthouse was quiet, the streets familiar, the movement of the city continuing as if nothing of importance were about to take place. And in a way, that was true, because the importance of this moment existed only within the small circle of people involved. And yet for me, it carried the weight of years, of choices made and unmade, of trust given and quietly taken advantage of. And when I arrived and stepped inside, the air felt cooler, the sound of footsteps echoing lightly against polished floors. And I noticed how everything in that building seemed designed to remove emotion, to reduce situations to facts, to statements, to documents. And I understood why that mattered, because emotion could be shaped, influenced, even manipulated, but facts, when clearly presented, did not require interpretation in the same way. And I found the courtroom with ease, the door already open, and as I stepped inside, I saw them immediately, Daniel and Ashley seated together, their posture relaxed, their expressions carrying a kind of quiet confidence that would have once unsettled me, but now simply confirmed what I already knew, that they believed this was already decided, that this was a formality, a final step in a process they had carefully constructed. And for a moment, I allowed myself to observe them without reacting, noticing the small details, the way Ashley leaned slightly forward as she spoke to their attorney, the way Daniel nodded along, his gaze focused anywhere but in my direction, and there was no anger in what I felt, only a distant recognition of how far things had moved from what they once were. And I took my seat without acknowledgement, not because I wished to avoid them, but because there was nothing to say that would change what was about to happen. And as the room slowly filled, the quiet murmur of voices settling into a low hum, I felt that same stillness return, the one that had followed me since the moment I first opened that envelope. And when Thomas entered and took his place beside me, there was no need for conversation, only a brief nod that carried everything that needed to be said. And as the proceedings began, the rhythm of the courtroom took over, structured, deliberate, each voice measured, each statement recorded, and I listened as their attorney spoke, presenting their case with confidence, outlining the agreements, the permissions, the steps that had led to this claim. And it was clear that they had prepared thoroughly, that they believed the narrative they were presenting was complete. And as I sat there, I understood something that felt almost simple in its clarity. They were telling a story that made sense from where they stood, a story built on the documents they had chosen to rely on. But it was not the whole story. And that difference, quiet as it was where everything would shift. And when it was Thomas's turn to speak, he did so without raising his voice, without urgency, simply presenting what had already been established long before this moment. The conditions, the provisions, the requirements that had to be met for any of those agreements to hold. And I watched as the room responded, not dramatically, but subtly, the kind of shift that happens when something unexpected enters a conversation, when the foundation of what was assumed begins to change. And I did not look at Daniel or Ashley then. I did not need to, because whatever realization was beginning to form for them would not come from me. It would come from what was being read, what was being recognized in that space where assumption could no longer stand without support. And as I sat there, listening, I felt no need to anticipate what would happen next, because for the first time since this began, I was not waiting for an outcome. I was simply present for the moment when everything would be seen clearly, not as it had been presented, but as it truly was. There is a moment in every room where certainty begins to fracture, not loudly, not in a way that draws immediate attention, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, And I saw that moment begin as Thomas continued to speak, his tone even, his words precise, each sentence placing something into the record that could not be easily dismissed. And at first, nothing seemed to change. Ashley remained composed, her posture still forward, her expression controlled, and Daniel sat beside her with that same distant focus, as if this were simply another step in a process they had already completed in their minds. But then it happened, not all at once, but in small ways that would have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching so carefully. Ashley's smile faded just slightly, not enough for anyone unfamiliar to notice, but enough to signal that something had shifted, and Daniel, who had avoided looking in my direction since I entered the room, began to glance toward Thomas, then back at their attorney, as if searching for confirmation that everything was still moving as expected. And I understood in that moment that what they were hearing was not aligning with what they had prepared for, and that misalignment was where their confidence began to loosen. And Thomas did not rush. He did not press. He simply continued, introducing the provisions my husband had established, the conditions tied to any transfer of authority, the requirement that all actions be conducted with full transparency and informed consent. And as those words settled into the room, I saw the first clear break in their composure. Ashley leaned closer to their attorney, her voice low but urgent, her earlier ease replaced with something tighter, more controlled, and Daniel's hands, which had rested calmly on the table, shifted slightly, fingers pressing together as if holding on to something that was beginning to slip. And I remained still, not out of restraint, but because there was nothing to add, nothing to explain. This was not a conversation that required my voice. It was unfolding exactly as it needed to. And when their attorney stood to respond, there was a subtle change in his tone as well, not dramatic, but enough to reveal that the ground beneath their argument was no longer as stable as it had been moments before. He spoke of interpretation, of intent, of the practical application of the agreements in question, but each point felt less certain, less anchored, as if it were reaching for something that was no longer fully within grasp. And the judge listened without interruption, the room settling into a deeper quiet, the kind that comes when attention sharpens, when every word carries weight. And I could feel the shift not just in them, but in the space itself, as if the narrative they had built was being slowly, methodically examined from a different angle, one they had not prepared for. And when Thomas spoke again, he did not challenge their statements directly. He did not raise his voice or attempt to overpower the room. He simply introduced what had always been there, the documentation, the language that defined the limits of any authority they believed they held. And it was in that moment that the difference became undeniable, because what they had relied on was partial, selective, built on pieces that supported their position, while what Thomas presented was complete, structured, leaving little room for interpretation once fully understood. And I saw it then, clearly, the moment when realization began to take hold. Not fully, not yet, but enough to change the way they sat, the way they listened, the way they no longer leaned forward with confidence, but instead held themselves more carefully, more cautiously. And I felt no satisfaction in that shift, no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that the truth, once fully revealed, does not need to announce itself. It simply stands, and everything around it adjusts accordingly. And as the proceedings continued, I remained present but detached, not because I did not care, but because I understood that this was no longer about me in the way it had once felt. It was about the alignment between what had been done and what had been agreed upon, and that alignment, or lack of it, would determine everything that followed. And for the first time since this began, I sensed that they were beginning to understand that as well, not through anything I had said, but through what they could no longer ignore. And as I sat there, listening to the careful exchange of words, the measured pace of the courtroom, I realized that the outcome they had expected was no longer certain. Not because something had changed in that moment, but because the full picture was finally coming into view, and that was something no amount of preparation on their part could undo. There is a point in every proceeding where the room no longer belongs to the people speaking, but to the words themselves, and I felt that shift fully when the bailiff was handed the final document. The one Thomas had placed carefully into the sequence of everything that had already been established, and it was done without emphasis, without ceremony, just a quiet motion, a transfer of paper from one hand to another. but I noticed how Ashley's attention snapped toward it immediately. How? Daniel's posture straightened slightly, as if something instinctive had told them that this moment carried more weight than the ones before. And for the first time since I had entered that room, I allowed myself to look directly at them, not with accusation, not with expectation, but simply to see them clearly, to observe the exact moment when understanding would begin to reach them. And the bailiff began to read, his voice steady, neutral, giving no indication of the impact the words would carry, and at first, nothing seemed unusual. The language formal, structured, consistent with everything that had come before. But then the details began to unfold, the conditions outlined in a way that left no room for interpretation. The requirement that any transfer of assets be accompanied by full disclosure, by documented consent that could be verified beyond assumption. And as those words settled into the room, I saw Ashley's expression change in a way that could not be hidden. Her confidence did not disappear all at once. It tightened, pulling inward as if trying to hold itself together. And Daniel, who had remained composed through most of the proceedings, shifted again, his gaze moving quickly between the bailiff and their attorney, searching for something. Perhaps an interruption, perhaps a correction, but none came. Because the reading continued, steady, unbroken, moving into the section that defined the consequences of any deviation from those conditions. And that was where the silence in the room deepened. Not because anyone had spoken, but because everyone understood that something irreversible was being established, and I felt no surge of emotion as I listened, no satisfaction, no sense of triumph. Only a quiet confirmation of what had already been set in motion long before this day, because the truth, once documented, does not need to defend itself, it simply exists. And as the bailiff reached the final portion of the document, the part my husband had ensured would be unmistakable, the effect became undeniable. Any attempt to claim authority over my assets without meeting those conditions resulted not in partial control, not in negotiation, but in complete disqualification from any claim whatsoever. And the clarity of that language left no space for reinterpretation, no room for adjustment. It was final in a way that did not require emphasis, and I watched as the realization settled fully this time, not in fragments, not in hesitation, but all at once. Ashley's composure gave way to something sharper, something closer to disbelief. Her earlier confidence replaced by a stillness that felt forced. And Daniel, for the first time since this began, looked directly at me, not with anger, not even with accusation, but with something far more uncertain, as if he were seeing the situation from a perspective he had not allowed himself to consider before. And I held his gaze for only a moment before looking away, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to exchange in that look. Everything that needed to be understood was already in the room, already spoken, and as the bailiff finished reading, the silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It was not empty. It was full, filled with the weight of what had just been made clear, and the judge's response, when it came, was measured, grounded entirely in what had been presented, acknowledging the conditions, the requirements, the outcome that followed from them. And in that moment, the structure they had built, the assumptions they had relied on, no longer held, not because they had been challenged emotionally, but because they did not align with what had been established long before they ever brought this case forward. And I remained where I was, my hands resting calmly in front of me, not moving, not reacting, because there was nothing left to do, nothing left to say. The outcome was not something I needed to claim. It had already been defined. And as the room began to shift again, voices lowering, papers being gathered, I understood that what had just happened was not a sudden reversal. It was the natural result of something they had never fully understood. And as I stood, not hurried, not delayed, simply moving forward with the same steady pace I had carried into that room, I realized that this moment, the one they had expected to secure everything, had instead revealed something far more lasting, not just about the documents or the outcome, but about the choices that had led us here, and the distance those choices had created. And I did not look back as I stepped away, because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. Everything that mattered had already been brought into the light. The hallway outside the courtroom felt longer than it had when I first walked in, not because anything had physically changed, but because the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air, quiet and undeniable. and I moved through it at the same steady pace I had carried all morning, not rushing, not slowing, simply continuing forward as if this were just another step in a path that had already been laid out long before today. And as the doors closed softly behind me, the sounds of the courtroom faded, replaced by the distant echo of footsteps and low voices that did not belong to me. And I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not carrying the tension I had expected. There was no need to replay what had been said, no urge to analyze every detail, because everything that mattered had already been made clear, and clarity, once it settles in fully, leaves very little room for doubt. And I paused briefly near the exit, not because I needed to gather myself, but because I wanted to acknowledge the moment for what it was, not a victory, not a defeat, but a conclusion, a quiet closing of something that had been unfolding for far longer than I had allowed myself to see. And as I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the air felt warmer than I remembered, the world continuing without interruption, cars passing, people moving along their own paths, unaware of what had just taken place inside that building. And there was something grounding in that, a reminder that even moments that feel defining exist within a larger flow that does not stop or pause. And I walked toward my car without hesitation, my steps measured, my thoughts steady, and as I reached for the door handle, I heard my name, not loudly, but enough to carry across the space between us, and I turned, not quickly, not with expectation, but simply to see, and there he was, Daniel, standing a few steps behind me, his posture uncertain in a way I had not seen before, as if the confidence he had carried into that courtroom had not followed him out. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us no longer heavy, but unfamiliar. And when he finally did speak, his voice was quieter than I remembered, not because he was unsure of the words, but because he seemed unsure of how they would land. And he said my name again, as if that alone might bridge the distance that had grown between us. But I did not step closer, I did not fill the silence for him the way I once would have. I simply stood where I was and listened, and he began to explain, not fully, not in a way that resolved anything, but in fragments, in pieces that sounded more like attempts to make sense of what had just happened than actual explanations. And I could hear the shift in his perspective, the way the certainty had been replaced by something less defined, something closer to realization. And I let him speak without interruption, not because I needed to hear it, but because this was not a moment that required correction, it required understanding. And when he finished, there was another pause, one that did not demand to be filled. And I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the boy he had been, not even as the man I had hoped he would become, but as he was in that moment. And I understood something then that I had not fully accepted before, that what had been lost between us was not something that could be restored with a conversation, not something that could be resolved with an apology or an explanation, because it was not built in a single moment. It had been shaped over time, through choices that had quietly moved us further apart until we arrived here. And I felt no anger as I stood there, no need to assign blame or to revisit what had led us to this point, because the truth was already clear, and clarity does not require repetition. And so when I spoke, my voice was steady, not cold, not distant, simply certain, and I told him that I understood more now than I had before, that I saw things as they were, not as I had once hoped they might be, and that understanding had changed something fundamental, not in the situation we had just left behind, but in me. And I did not say anything about the outcome. I did not mention what had been decided or what it meant going forward, because those things no longer needed to be explained. They existed on their own, independent of anything I might add to them. And he listened without interrupting, his expression shifting in a way that suggested he was hearing more than just the words. And when I finished, I did not wait for a response, not because I did not care what he might say, but because I understood that whatever needed to be said would not come in this moment. It would come, if it came at all, over time, through actions rather than words. And I gave him a small nod, not as a dismissal, but as an acknowledgement. And then I turned back to my car, opening the door and settling into the driver's seat with the same steady movement I had carried throughout the day. And as I closed the door and looked ahead, I felt something settle into place, not relief, not even closure in the traditional sense, but a quiet acceptance of what was. And as I started the engine and pulled away, leaving the courthouse behind, I understood that what they had tried to take had never truly been theirs to claim, not because of the documents or the outcome, but because of something far simpler, something they had overlooked entirely. And as the road stretched out in front of me, I realized that I had not lost anything that day. I had simply seen everything clearly for the first time, and that clarity was something no one could take from me.